Thanks for joining us on the podcast of the History Teachers Association of New South Wales. Today's episode is an interview with Michael Street, who was recipient of a Premier's Teacher Scholarship sponsored by HTA New South Wales in 2019. Michael's study tour took him to the United States and England, where he explored the history and historiography of witch hunts and witch trials. He's since written a chapter covering this topic in the second edition of the History Extension Resource Book, published by HTA New South Wales last year, and in the interview we try to put the general historiography of witch hunts and witch trials into some broad perspective, and also explore some specific historians who have weighed in on these debates. I'd like to thank Michael for taking the time to talk to me, and I hope you enjoy this interview. So we're going to chat about the witch hunts here, so the case study for History Extension. And I thought it would be best to just begin by trying to do something fairly simple, and that is define or give sort of broad boundaries around what we're talking about when we're talking about witch hunts and witch trials.
The question sounds really simple, but it's totally not. What we can broadly say is that the witch hunts period takes place between 1450 and 1750. Where a period of about 300 years, where approximately 40,000 to 60,000 people died, executed for the crime of witchcraft. It's wide-ranging, ranging from Europe all the way to across the Atlantic to the USA. But we also have lots of evidence of witch hunting continuing through to this day. So even in 2021, 600 people will probably die in the world as a consequence of a witch hunt.
Where do these come from? I mean, they obviously they don't just sort of pop out of nowhere. So what are the factors that are underpinning the inspiration for chasing witches and executing them? I mean, it sounds quite extreme from a contemporary perspective.
Yeah, you definitely need a religious foundation for a witch hunt to occur. Ignoring the kind of modern Twitter-based use of the word witch hunt, you do need that religious base, that fear of the unknown, that fear of superstition, that fear of individuals having enormous power over the world, which no one can do anything about. So in Europe, it's largely Christian, but in Central Africa, you have these small, private, tribal-based religions that have an emphasis on a fear of witchcraft there as well. So anthropologists heading into Central Africa in the 17th and 18th century were quite wary of the fact that they could be accused of witchcraft quite easily.
And I imagine, therefore, the sort of definition of what a witch is varying quite a lot from place to place. Is that a fair assumption?
Yeah, so we have witchcraft being feared even in ancient Rome. So there is concerns around witchcraft in Rome, and there's no Christian basis for that. Often when we think of the witch in the public imagination, we're considering someone who is inside a Christian framework, someone who is tied to Satan in some way. And we even see that in popular television shows today, like Sabrina, the Teenage Witch, and things like that, where these people are tied to Satan and gain their power from them. That's not necessarily the case for witches across the world. There are different sources for where witches gain their power.
In your chapter for the HTA's book, the History Extension Resource Book, where you look at this topic, you really zero in on the Salem witch trials as the kind of focus. And that seems to be a way to bring this very broad, very expansive sort of idea of witch hunts, which aren't really categorized in the syllabus in terms of a time frame, are they? It's just quite an open-ended topic. So you use the Salem witch trials, try to bring that down to something concrete, and then explore the historiography through that. So maybe you could just set up those witch trials as a specific case for us as well here. What happened there in that case in Massachusetts there?
So in 1692, in winter, around about January, a young girl, the daughter of a reverend in the area, starts fitting unnaturally. Around about the same time, about a 45-minute walk away, another girl starts fitting. Doctors are brought into the region and they start examining the girls. The doctors conclude that it's most likely witchcraft that is causing these uncontrollable fits. And then you have a group of ministers come in from outside Salem village into the area to start examining these girls as well to provide a secondary opinion. And they also come to the conclusion that we have witchcraft on their hands. Now, from this point, you have not the beginning of a witch hunt yet. Most witch hunts fizzle out before they even begin. So this could just be a case of a small example of witchcraft where there's no need for a witch hunt to break out. But what does happen is the maid slave Tituba is accused as the cause of these girls' maladies. We don't know why, but Tituba decides to claim that there is an enormous number of witches in the Salem village area. And it might be to try and deflect, it might be to try and get out of it in some way. But what she does is confirm in the eyes of ministers in the village at the time who are already deeply fearful of witchcraft, it confirms to them that they are completely surrounded by Satan's agents and that they need to go and find them. And thus begins a series of accusations all across the region. It ties in the Massachusetts Bay Colony, accusations all across there, all the way up to the Maine frontier. It's called the Salem Witch Hunt, but it encompasses the entire Massachusetts Bay Colony and north. Accusations also go all the way south to New York as well. So it's an enormous thing. It draws in the entire population. And at the center of this is this group of girls who are initially fitting. And they, by being in close proximity to witchcraft, claim to know who was at fault for their maladies. And so they start accusing people of witchcraft. They accuse women who are beggars in the region, but then they start to attack people who are closer to them. These people are brought in for interrogation. They're interrogated publicly with the accusers in the room as well. And this would have been a horrifying experience for the people who were being interrogated. It would have been noisy. There would have been people screaming, yelling. You would have had the accusers all fainting left, right, and center. And the person who's accused not knowing how to defend themselves appropriately. Out of this comes the execution of 19 people and one person who is pressed to death. We also have probably somewhere in the order of 150 formal accusations and somewhere upwards of 1,000 to 1,500 informal accusations. When we consider that the population of the colony at the time is somewhere between about 100,000 people. 1,500 people being informally accused is quite considerable. What brings an end to it is the accusations become a bit too crazy. They start accusing people they don't know the appearance of. So accusees enter interrogation rooms with the crowd of people and the girls can't actually identify who they are accusing. And they start accusing people higher and higher up in status until they start accusing the wives of people in governance. And that's when members of governance put their foot down and put an end to it. By 1693, all of the leftover accusees are acquitted.
So if we focus in on the debates around the witch trials, so we kind of get closer to, I guess, the nuts and bolts of what we're doing in history extension. What I want to talk to you a little bit about before we look at some specific examples of historians and interpretations is some of the broader features of the debate. So thinking about the role of different factors that are kind of, I guess, making historians or pushing historians to different interpretations. So I wondered if we could begin with something you mentioned earlier, and that is this idea of worldview. It sounds really crucial that historians and people who are representing this history, the worldview plays a really crucial role, it seems, to the way they actually do this. So I wonder if you can unpack that for us.
So witchcraft is not a crime that exists in reality. Witchcraft is a crime of the mind. That Robin Briggs calls it a crime of the mind. It is something which exists in our imaginations. It's something that haunts us and follows us. It's something that's really intangible. So even if we get a grip on all of the facts, which, especially when we consider Salem witch trials, we know an enormous amount about what happened in Salem in 1692. It's one of the most heavily researched periods of American history. But what we find is that your position on those in-between areas, those liminal areas, your perspectives on God, your perspectives on superstition, witchcraft, they will naturally start to infiltrate the way that you perceive the origins and causes of witch hunts. There are, of course, naturalistic explanations that we can give, and I'm sure we'll talk about those later. But what we find is that worldview is the critical point, how you see the world constructed. So as like a really crucial example, not many people are aware that Heinrich Himmler was essential to the development of witchcraft histories in Europe. So Heinrich Himmler led a team to collect as much data as possible about the German witch hunts. Now, why was that? It was part of the education program, a part of that transformation to construct the witch hunts as a Jewish attack on Christians. That Jews were central to witch hunts, and the goal of witch hunts was to destroy Christians. Now,
this is obviously used within the context of the Nazi regime, and it
totally.
And so his worldview is just really kind of, shaping almost everything that he's going to see and perceive in this issue. Yeah.
Yeah, 100%. And sadly, if you are a historian working in German witchcraft histories, you're going to have to work with material created by the Nazis. You can't really get around it. So we come back to Salem. It is in a Protestant Reformed context, highly Christian, I guess you could say. And so the initial perspectives on it are going to be reading the event through scripture, through that lens of God existing and being sovereign and things like that. Whereas when we come to our von Ronchian period, that's when we get the empiricism coming through. And you start to see God start to leak out of those histories. And it's only in more recent times that we have started to have a more empathetic view of the worldview of people in the past. Malcolm Gaskill, for example, is a big fan of almost uncritically accepting the weirdness of the worldviews of early modern people. That if they claim to have seen something, to an extent, we should accept that that's what they believe they saw. And that makes it very hard for us as historians who constantly want to find the answer to what these people are really seeing. And he would argue that does a disservice to the people who made those sources.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I mean, as you were talking about that, I was thinking, about some ways that worldview could really contrast a historian's interpretation. I mean, if you believe that supernatural things happen, then you're in a position to accept that, the cause of this might have been some actual witchcraft and some actual supernatural activity. Whereas if you're going to take a more naturalistic, materialistic interpretation, you're going to look for some outside, some different force that's going to shape this. And it might be mass hysteria, or it might be group psychology, or, whatever it is.
Totally.
Yeah. So there's a nice contrast depending on what you believe.
Yeah.
I guess moving in a similar direction, the role of, say, different approaches to history and different theories about history, do we see that shaping the debates with the witch hunts and witch trials a lot?
Yeah, I do think so. That I'm going to use some like society and culture language of rational choice theory and structural functionalism. The theories about witch hunts tend to swing violently between them. You either tend to sit really hard in functionalism or sit really hard in rational choice theory. And it's only in the last 10 years that people have been able to safely navigate the line in between.
So what are those? Can you just summarize what they are?
So rational choice theory is the belief that people are essentially cost-benefit machines, that they act in a way that seeks out the best possible outcomes for themselves. So like the best example of this would be like The Crucible, where the girls are basically out to get everybody that is against them. It is intentional, evil, ugly. It's and totally about trying to get the best possible outcomes for them.
And logical. They've got a plan, they're enacting the plan, and they're moving towards an actual outcome that they want.
Yeah, rational choice theory doesn't necessarily require you to have a plan, but people tend to do it subconsciously. But plans are definitely part of rational choice theory. On the other hand, structural functionalism is the idea that people are essentially cogs in a massive machine, which is society. So it's the idea that if there is a problem with one of the cogs, it gets cut out of the machine. An example of this in society is prison. If you misbehave inside that machine, you get removed from it and you're placed outside that system. The other way that structural functionalism works is if there is a problem with a cog, the whole machine might change to fit with the cog. What we find is that theories like mass hysteria are straight up structural functionalist ideas, that individuals don't have control over their individual lives. They're almost like carried along on the flow of history. And so when I'm talking with people about witch hunts, witchcraft, people will often articulate one of these two perspectives. Oh, it was all just girls trying to get out to get everybody who was against them. Or it was all just mass hysteria. They just had no idea what they were doing. Everyone just went nuts and went along with it. It's really hard to walk that fine line in between. But we do see that at least until the last 10, 15 years, the majority of writing in this space swings fairly violently between those two positions.
Some topics that we look at in history and some periods of history do experience a thing that, often people talk about as like this archival revolution. There's sort of documents or whatever it is that have been locked up for ages or lost or whatever. They find these documents and they sort of break open a whole new conversation about the specific aspect of the past that we're looking at. Is there anything like that with the history of witch trials, or has it been more of a sort of gradual, expansion of the research and understanding?
So the leaps in our archival knowledge have come a fairly long time ago. So we had a fairly set collection of data from the 1860s with Charles Upham. And then we'd go through another leap in 1974 when Boyer and Nissenbaum traveled throughout Massachusetts looking for sources in church basements and things like that. And priests and ministers just hand over legal documents that are 300 years old without even thinking about it. And we had another small leap in 2002 with Mary Beth Norton's research in the Massachusetts Archive. She went to the miscellaneous section of the archive and started digging and found some really interesting letters and things like that. But I would say pretty firmly we're in interpretation mode right now, improving our methodologies, improving our philosophies around how these kinds of events take place.
And I suppose looking at it from a range of new perspectives, as historians tend to do when the evidence base is a bit more established, it's about finding different ways to look at it and different, lenses through which to sort of see the evidence and that sort of thing. It sounds like that's where it's at.
Yeah.
So can we then go, I guess, a step further in a more specific direction and actually start looking at a couple of different schools of thought or historians and sources that you might look at in this case study? And in your chapter that I referred to before in the History Extension resource book, you have a really interesting table of a variety of different approaches and different ways of looking at the witch trials. And so what I wanted to do is just maybe pick out a couple of those and talk about them specifically for a moment. And maybe we can start with the first one that you mentioned there, which you called the Enchanted approach. What is this approach? What's sort of framing it, and what are the conclusions that are being drawn there?
So I've used the language of Charles Taylor to describe this approach. Charles Taylor constructs this worldview as one that is filled with gods. The supernatural world is in the natural world. Satan is a person walking around doing things, making deals with people. Angels, demons, the works, they are there all the time. So the Enchanted approach, I chose John Hale as my good example of the Enchanted approach. He is a minister from Beverly, which is just north of Salem town, modern day Salem, and his grave is there. For those people who want to go traveling, you can go see it. And he was someone who turned against the trials. His wife was accused of witchcraft, which made him very suddenly change his perspective on the trials. But what he does in his analysis of the trials after it takes place is he takes scripture, examples of demonic possession and witchcraft in scripture, and then uses those as a litmus test to examine the veracity of the girls' claims of their own witchcraft experiences. What he essentially ends up claiming is that the girls were probably not entirely truthful. Surprise, surprise. But he then reanalyzes the trials as a whole and shows that it's probably best to think of the trials themselves as an act of Satan to destroy Christians rather than actually hunting down witches. So Satan was still behind the trials themselves, but not in a way that was initially thought at the time in 1692.
So he obviously doesn't escape the enchantedness that you described before. He's using it, but just in a different way to come to a different conclusion.
Yeah, not at all. He does not escape from it. He accepts it willingly, and yeah, it's a valuable perspective as a primary source as well. He was there, which is quite valuable. He would have been sitting there in those interrogations with the screaming all around him.
And they're important. The way people are interpreting these events as they unfold is really important. They often shape the later conversations in a lot of ways, don't they? So it's good to look at. I think it's really good to look at those early sources in these topics, because you often find as well, you come across, say later, even contemporary historians and their conclusions. And the more of these early perspectives you have on a lot of historical topics, you find that there are echoes of this just coming through in the later historians. They just have different sources and slightly different, language that they often use. So it's really valuable from that perspective as well, I think. Yeah.
Yes.
And then you contrast that Enchanted sort of approach to, you call it the Enlightenment sort of, or empirical approach, the sort of empiricism that grew out of the Enlightenment, I suppose, is the underpinning thing there. How does that contrast to this Enchanted approach to the interpretations?
So there's a general rejection of demonology as a philosophical science. So there is even a move towards the rejection of demonology as a good explanation for the end of witch hunts, that elites in universities, book writers, ministers start to reject demonology as a science. That has well and truly set in by the time these guys are writing. And so I think a really good example of that is 19th century, smack bang in the middle of the American Civil War, is Charles Upham. And he very much is one of the earliest examples of someone arguing for mass hysteria, that he meticulously goes through the sources. His text is ridiculously enormous. I will admit I've not read the whole thing. I pity the person who does. It is huge, but he really takes a big leap forward in method for using sources exclusively rather than interpretation through scripture and through superstition to explore a cause of the trials or the nature of the trials. That's not to say that he's entirely escaping enchantedness, because he himself is a minister. So he has that kind of professional distance as a historian by utilizing the empirical methodology.
So when you're talking about this, rigorous use of the sources that he's using, and it sounds like he's quite, you said meticulous. It's obviously expansive research. It gives me, kind of overtones of von Runke very much in that sense of
Yep.
trying to be very scientific about the way he's looking at this, and so he's not willing to accept, the truth or falsity of, say, witchcraft. Just on the basis of the claims that these people made. He's going to test the sources and try and unpack them. Is that the kind of flavor of the work?
Yeah. He even goes to the extent of mapping all of the homes of accusers and accusees across the entire region. Boyer and Nissenbaum in 1974 get all the credit for creating the map showing that Western Salem Village was all the accusers and Eastern Salem Village is all the accusees. But they borrowed the map from Upham, who made it 110 years earlier. So, yeah, it's quite incredible what he managed to pull off and do it with that empirical distance.
And I think there's an important thing there with those historians. I mean, often, empiricism's like the sort of the easy thing to criticize in history extension, I think, a lot of the time. And often, I mean, I do this, like I sort of set it up as the point of, the punching bag for the whole course in a sense. It's like there are clearly limitations to this in my view. So what are we going to do about history if it's not this, is kind of the way it's discussed. But I really do think we discredit some of the work that those historians did, those very scientific historians, because they often did just gather amazing source material that people have been using ever since on a whole range of topics here, and I think you can easily throw out let's say you can throw out the theory. You mightn't agree with empiricism as a way of doing history in general, but I think it's still important to maybe respect the value of that approach and what it brought us as later observers. Let's contrast another group then, and I thought this was interesting because it sort of seemed obvious, but I couldn't really imagine how it would work out in a specific set of arguments. So you include feminist history here in terms of looking at the witch trials and witch hunts. What sorts of things have they been observing, and how are they approaching this differently?
Yeah, feminist history in witch hunts feels like the most intuitive thing on the planet, but it totally isn't. It's something that only came about really in the early to mid 20th century. So even though it was clear early on that women far outweighed men in numbers of executed peoples in both Salem and in Europe, they were not really particularly interested in those questions around why women were targeted. So that's what really sets feminist history and witch trials apart, is they ask that question. So don't make the mistake of thinking that historians prior to the 20th century didn't realize that women were the main target of witch hunts. Rather, they just were not super interested in it. So a good way of looking at feminist history and witch hunts is the traditional approach, that you have vulnerable women who stood to gain from some kind of inheritance, who may have lost their partners to disease or something like that. And these women are in a position of potentially gaining power and risk overthrowing societal balance in some kind of way. And so someone like Carol Carlson would say that these women are more likely to be accused of witchcraft. That's not to say they will be accused of witchcraft, they're more likely to be accused of witchcraft. And so men use witch hunts to punish women for rising above their station in that way. But then by the 90s, you have a bit of a flip. You have someone like Elizabeth Reyes, who does a linguistic approach. And so she, using textual analysis, suggests that there are female confessions and male confessions, that there are particular flavors to these confessions, that these women in a Puritan context have a tendency to have a very deep understanding of their depravity. And the depravity of fellow women. And so are more likely to confess and accuse their fellow women, whereas men were less likely to confess at all, and even less likely to accuse other men.
So she's really tapping into the sort of cultural, she's trying to paint a picture of the cultural landscape and how men and women tend to behave and what they tended to believe, and how that shapes their decision making in the process.
Yeah. It's because like one of the great mysteries of witch hunting as a historical set of questions is, why did so many people confess? Like, these people obviously know they haven't committed witchcraft, then why are they confessing? And so Reyes is answering that question through a feminist framework. And then probably like a bit of quite a strong strike through this perspective is Mary Beth Norton's work. Mary Beth Norton is a brilliant feminist historian who is also an empiricist. So she's quite fascinating. I interviewed her for 3 hours, and she was currently moving offices and tried to give me a whole bunch of her books, but I couldn't take them with me, sadly, because I couldn't fit them in my bag. But she makes the claim that the Salem witch hunt is a holistically gendered experience of persecution. Salem has an unusually high number of men being killed as a proportion, in contrast to European witch hunts. And so what we need to really ask, not so much is why are women targeted in the witch hunts in Salem, but why are men so highly represented there as well? And that seems to be a bit of a hole sometimes in a lot of feminist analysis. So when I spoke with Lyndall Roper at Oxford, who's an Australian, she wrote a brilliant book called Witch Craze, which is a psychoanalytic perspective on women in witch hunts. And she admitted that there was a gap there because she didn't have a chapter on men. So Mary Beth Norton, by looking at the Wabanaki Wars, which is like this big colonial frontier war taking place about the same time as the Salem witch hunt, that both men are experiencing enormous trauma through the loss of their partners, through personally experiencing violence. And so their roles as men are challenged. But also women are experiencing enormous trauma because their husbands are being murdered, their children are being murdered, and as a consequence are being left out in the cold with no source of income, no source of protection. And so she constructs the Salem witch hunts not so much as a top-down men punishing women, but as something which nets all gendered experiences in painful and traumatic ways.
So it's more of a, again, she's looks like she's coming at that from a much bigger perspective there and trying to look at the landscape of attitudes and values and what people are experiencing in other areas of life and are bringing to these witch trials. I mean, this is a great example. I love this stuff because it's a great example of how, historians are looking for different forces at work in the past, aren't they? The Enchanted approach is that this is supernatural and there are spirit beings that are pushing things around on Earth, so to speak. Then you've got the Enlightenment, approach that's looking for a really rational explanation of how this all fits together. Whereas these historians, particularly the later examples you mentioned there, are really interested in how culture shapes the behavior of people and the traces of that culture in these documents that they can find. It's a really good example of that, I think.
And it's structural functionalism raising its head again.
It's exactly right.
Yeah, the people are caught up in the contours of culture and the flows of history and don't really have a great deal of individual control over their lives.
And even I suppose, you can accept that, can't you? That the context of these people are really shaping a lot of what they're seeing and a lot of what they're reacting to. And even though many of them, I suppose, would have claimed to have been highly rational and highly sort of, genuine in their testimony and all of this sort of stuff, these historians are kind of saying, they probably weren't as aware of these things that were at work on them at the time.
Yeah, Yeah, totally.
And so you've also been doing a little bit of work on the history of emotions and how this connects to the interpretations of the witch trials. Set that up for us, because the history of emotions for some people would just sound like a bizarre thing, but it is a thing.
Yes.
So what is it, and how is it sort of influencing interpretations here?
You and I see our world through our emotions. We're constantly feeling and experiencing the world. They don't show up overly readily in written sources, but emotions are central to our experiences. And as historians, if we are examining events that people participate in, their emotions are going to be related to those experiences. And if we go back to what I said about witchcraft being a crime of the mind, what better place is there to be to examine how people experience that through their emotions? A good example of that is people confessing to emotional crimes. Everybody, even though they don't like to admit it, have these things called intrusive thoughts. We've all had them, and you may have never talked about it with anybody or anything like that. Psychologists often laugh when it's brought up at conferences because everyone's experienced it.
So these are just thoughts that pop into your head from seemingly nowhere that you're not really in control of, but may have some influence on your attitude and so on.
Yeah. And so if you believe that something like witchcraft has control over the reality, it comes from a place that doesn't exist in reality, it exists in the supernatural world. If you are having an argument with someone and their cow dies the next day, and let's just say you had an intrusive thought about harming that person in some way, if you're accused of witchcraft, you're probably going to be more likely to confess, because it's a crime of the mind. It's a crime of magic. It's of something that you can't really control yourself. And it's also about your relationship with God, that if you feel like you have been having thoughts about Satan, if you feel like you have been struggling with your relationship with God, and something like this happens, you are feeling guilty about your relationship with God, you are more likely to lean into a confession of witchcraft, because you may genuinely believe that you did something that you did not do.
That's a fascinating direction. I mean, I know of a few other history of emotions projects going on at the moment, and that's actually helping clarify what these people are probably up to actually in their research. Yeah. So that's really good. And it sounds like there's lots more to explore, and things are unfolding all the time with witch hunts and the historiography of that. So I look forward to seeing what you come up with next, and what the next little wave of all of this is. So congratulations again on the scholarship. I know it's been a while now, but it's borne lots of fruit. And thanks for spending time with us talking about all this today.
Thank you. It's my pleasure.